In the aftermath of one of history's bloodiest conflicts, in a moment when hatred seemed permanent and wounds too deep to heal, something impossible happened that changed everything we thought we knew about human nature, about enemies, and about the power of a single act of compassion. Before we dive into this story that will challenge everything you believe about war and humanity, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and whether you think enemies can truly become friends. Because what you're about to witness isn't just history, it's a testament to the indestructible thread of humanity that survives even in our darkest hours. This is the story of a day in 1946, in the ruins of post-war Japan, when a British soldier did something so unexpected, so contrary to every protocol, every military regulation, and every ounce of historical precedent, that it shattered the boundaries between victor and vanquished, between occupier and occupied, between enemy and human being. What happened in those few hours on a devastated street in Yokohama wasn't documented in official military records. It wasn't celebrated in newspapers. It wasn't part of any diplomatic strategy. But it rewrote the rules of what's possible when one person chooses compassion over compliance, shared suffering over separation, and common humanity over convenient hatred. The world had just emerged from a war that claimed over 70 million lives. Japan lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, infrastructure destroyed, food supply chains obliterated. The occupation had begun, and with it came an atmosphere thick with resentment, fear, and the bitter taste of defeat. British soldiers patrolled the streets, representatives of the Allied victory, symbols of Japan's humiliation. They were the conquerors, the enemy, the other side. And yet, beneath those uniforms, beneath the weight of military authority and the burden of representing an occupying force, they were something else entirely. Something the Japanese civilians couldn't yet see, and something that would soon become impossible to ignore. Captain Thomas Harrison wasn't what anyone expected from a British officer in occupied Japan. At 32 years old, he was lean, almost gaunt, with eyes that had seen too much and a posture that suggested both authority and exhaustion. He had survived 4 years on the front lines, from North Africa to Burma, leading his men through hell and back. But what made Harrison different? What set him apart from other officers wasn't his military record or his tactical brilliance. It was something quieter, something that had been forged not in the heat of battle but in the cold reality of shared human suffering. Before the war, Harrison had been a schoolteacher in a poor mining town in northern England. He had known hunger. He had known what it meant to stretch a meal, to watch children go without, to understand that suffering doesn't discriminate based on nationality or uniform. That perspective never left him. Even as he commanded troops, even as he followed orders, even as he wore the uniform of the victor, he carried with him an uncomfortable truth that his superiors wished he would forget. The people they occupied were human beings, just as hungry, just as desperate, just as worthy of dignity as anyone else. On that morning in early March, Harrison received his orders. Distribute rations to the troops stationed in the Yokohama sector, maintain order, and, under absolutely no circumstances, engage with or provide assistance to Japanese civilians. The policy was clear, enforced by Colonel Reginald Whitmore, a rigid career officer who viewed any fraternization with the Japanese as a betrayal of the soldiers who had died fighting them. Whitmore represented old guard military thinking. Enemies remain enemies. Occupation means control, and compassion is weakness that undermines authority. He had made his position brutally clear in morning briefings, his voice sharp and uncompromising. These people were our enemies 6 months ago. They celebrated when our boys died. They tortured prisoners. They deserve nothing from us except our vigilance and our control. Any soldier caught sharing resources with civilians will face court-martial. Am I understood? Harrison had nodded, had said, "Yes, sir," had followed protocol. But as he walked through the devastated streets of Yokohama that morning, carrying crates of rations for his men, something inside him began to crack. The destruction was total. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets littered with rubble, and everywhere the faces of hunger. Children with distended bellies and hollow eyes. Elderly men and women who looked decades older than they were, shuffling through ruins searching for anything edible. And mothers, God, the mothers. Women who clutched infants to their chests, their own bodies emaciated, their eyes carrying a particular kind of desperation that only a parent who cannot feed their child can understand. One of these mothers was Yuki Tanaka. She was 26 but looked 40, her face gaunt, her traditional clothing hanging loosely on a frame that had once been healthy and strong. She carried her 3-year-old daughter, Aiko, on her back. The child's crying now reduced to weak whimpers. Yuki hadn't eaten in 2 days. She had given her last portion of rice to Aiko the previous evening, and even that had been pitifully small. Now she stood outside what had once been a market, hoping, praying that somehow, somewhere, there might be food. Her husband had died in the war, one of millions. Her parents had perished in the bombings. She was alone with her daughter in a city of ghosts, and she was losing the battle to keep them both alive. Around Yuki, other mothers gathered, perhaps 24 women, some with children, some already having lost them. They watched as British soldiers moved through the street, carrying crates marked with English words they couldn't read but knew contained food. Their eyes followed those crates with a hunger that transcended language, with a desperation that needed no translation. And in their eyes was something else too: resentment, bitterness, the complicated emotions of people who must watch their conquerors eat while they starve. They were the enemy. They had brought this destruction. And yet, they had food, and the mothers did not. And that stark reality created a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. But it wasn't just the mothers who watched. Lieutenant James Barker, one of Harrison's subordinates, stood nearby, his face hard with judgment. Barker was 24, fresh-faced despite the war, and rigidly adherent to military protocol. He had lost a brother in Burma, and his hatred of the Japanese was personal and absolute. "They deserve this," he had said more than once. "They started it. Let them finish it hungry." Next to him stood Sergeant Robert Mills. Older, more pragmatic, but equally convinced that helping civilians was foolish sentimentality that would be interpreted as weakness. And watching from a military vehicle parked at the corner was Colonel Whitmore himself. His presence a clear reminder of the consequences of disobedience, his eyes scanning for any sign of breach in protocol, any hint of the softness he despised. Harrison stopped walking. The crate in his hands, filled with tins of meat, hardtack biscuits and tea, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He looked at his men, well fed by military standards, though even they showed signs of rationing. Then he looked at the mothers, at Yuki holding her dying daughter, at the circle of women whose eyes carried both hope and hatred. The protocol was clear. The orders were explicit. His career, his standing, possibly his freedom hung on obedience. And yet, in that moment, something older than military regulations, something more fundamental than national boundaries, something that connected. Every human being who had ever known hunger spoke louder than any commanding officer ever could. Harrison set down his crate. The sound of wood hitting stone echoed in the sudden silence. Every eye turned to him. His own men stiffened, confused. Barker's face showed alarm, then anger. From the vehicle, Whitmore leaned forward, his expression darkening. The mothers watched, uncertain, afraid even to hope. And Harrison, his hands now free, his decision made, walked directly toward Yuki Tanaka. He reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out his personal ration, a small tin of corned beef and 2 biscuits, his lunch and dinner for that day. Without a word, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of the protocol he was shattering, he extended it toward her. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from his own hunger, his own body's recognition of what he was giving away. The world seemed to stop. Yuki stared at the food, then at Harrison's face. She saw his uniform, the symbol of occupation. She saw his nation's flag. She saw everything that represented loss, defeat, suffering. But she also saw something else. She saw his face, thin, tired, the pronounced cheekbones, the hollows under his eyes, the slight tremble in his outstretched hand, and she realized with a shock that cut through every barrier of language and history. This soldier was hungry too. He was giving her food he needed, food his own body craved, food that meant the difference between functioning and collapsing. He was starving, and he was giving her what little he had. "Captain Harrison, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Barker's voice cut through the moment like a whip. He strode forward, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Sir, you're violating direct orders. Colonel Whitmore is watching. Stop this immediately." Harrison didn't turn. He kept his hand extended toward Yuki, his eyes meeting hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every person on that street. "Lieutenant Barker, when did following orders become more important than being human?" "Sir, that's not the point. The point is chain of command, military discipline, and the fact that we're occupying forces, not a charity operation. These people were our enemies. Their soldiers killed our men. They don't deserve our compassion. Now Harrison did turn, and the look in his eyes made Barker take a step back. Deserve? Harrison's voice rose slightly, still controlled but carrying an edge that silenced further interruption. Tell me, Lieutenant, what does a 3-year-old child deserve? What did she do to deserve starvation? Did she pilot a plane? Did she command troops? Or is she just a human being, born in the wrong place at the wrong time, paying the price for decisions made by old men she'll never meet? That's sentimentality, sir. That's weakness. Sergeant Mills had joined them now, his face showing concern rather than anger. Sir, with respect, if we start giving away rations, where does it end? We have our own men to feed. We have protocols for a reason. And forgive me for saying it, but these people wouldn't have shared with us if the situation were reversed. Harrison's expression softened slightly, became almost sad. Maybe you're right, Sergeant. Maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe that's exactly why we should. He turned back to Yuki, who still stood frozen, afraid to take what was offered, afraid not to. I can't change what happened. I can't bring back the dead or rebuild the cities. But I can share a meal. I can recognize that hunger feels the same in English or Japanese. I can remember that before I was a soldier, before I was British, before I was anything else, I was human. And so is she. The silence that followed was profound. The street, despite being filled with people, seemed utterly still. Every British soldier watched their captain. Every Japanese mother watched the exchange. And somewhere in that collective holding of breath, something fundamental shifted. Harrison took another step toward Yuki and gently, carefully, placed the tin and biscuits into her trembling hands. For your daughter, he said in English, then repeated in badly accented phrasebook Japanese. Musume no tamni. Yuki's eyes filled with tears, her hands closed around the food, and for a moment, she just stared at it. This impossible gift from an impossible source. Then she looked up at Harrison's face again, really looked, and saw not a conquering soldier but a fellow parent. A fellow human being on the edge of survival, choosing to share rather than hoard, to connect rather than divide. She bowed deeply, the Japanese gesture of profound respect and gratitude, and whispered, "Arigato gozaimasu," with such emotion that no translation was needed. But Harrison wasn't finished. The break in protocol, once made, seemed to liberate something in him that had been constrained for too long. He turned to his men, who stood watching with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to continued disapproval. Gentlemen, I'm going to give you an order now, and I'm going to make it clear that this order comes from me personally, not from command. Anyone who wishes to share a portion of their rations with these civilians has my permission and my protection. Anyone who doesn't wish to is under no obligation. But understand this, we're not just here to occupy. We're here to demonstrate that we're better than the worst of what war made us. This is your choice. The silence stretched. Barker's face showed outrage, his mouth opening to protest again. Mills looked conflicted, glancing between his captain and the mothers. Other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of decision pressing down on them. And then, from the back of the group, a young private named David Walsh stepped forward. He was barely 19, thin as a rail himself, but he reached into his pack and pulled out a tin of condensed milk. Without a word, he walked to the mother nearest to him and handed it over. The woman, shocked, accepted it with shaking hands. That single action broke the dam. One by one, British soldiers stepped forward. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. A sergeant gave away his tea rations. A corporal shared hardtack biscuits. A lance corporal handed over canned vegetables. Each soldier who participated became a small act of rebellion, a tiny revolution against the machinery of hatred and division. The Upiobo Japanese mothers, initially too shocked to react, began to respond. Bows, tears, whispered thanks, and something else. They reached out tentatively, touching the soldiers' hands as they received the food, making contact, acknowledging the humanity of the exchange. From his vehicle, Colonel Whitmore erupted. He strode toward the gathering, his face purple with rage, his bearing radiating authority and fury in equal measure. Captain Harrison, stand down immediately. This is a direct order. All soldiers, cease this activity at once. This is insubordination. This is treason. This is a violation of every regulation governing occupied territories. His voice boomed across the street, and several soldiers did stop, stepping back, fear of military justice overriding their momentary compassion. Harrison turned to face his superior officer, came to attention but didn't retreat. Sir, with all due respect, I'm following a higher protocol than military regulations. There is no higher Protocol and military regulations for a soldier, Captain. You're not a civilian. You don't have the luxury of personal ethics. You follow orders. Even when those orders contradict basic human decency, sir? The confrontation had drawn everyone's attention. The street became an arena, with Whitmore and Harrison at its center, representing two fundamentally different philosophies. The colonel's face was a mask of controlled fury, his military bearing perfect, his authority absolute. Human decency? You want to talk about human decency? Where was Japanese human decency when they massacred prisoners, when they conducted medical experiments, when they bombed civilians? Where was their compassion then, Captain? Harrison didn't flinch. It wasn't there, sir. And I'm not excusing it, not forgetting it, not minimizing it, but I'm also not going to become it. If we respond to atrocity with cruelty, to hatred with more hatred, to dehumanization with more dehumanization, then what exactly? Did we win? What did our soldiers die for? Just to trade places in the cycle of suffering. They died for victory, Captain. For justice. For their countries and their brothers in arms. No, sir. Harrison's voice was firm now, no longer deferential. They died hoping for a world that would be better than the one that sent them to war. They died hoping that their children wouldn't have to fight the same battles. They died believing that humanity was worth saving. And if we can't demonstrate that belief, if we can't show that we're capable of transcending revenge, then we dishonor their sacrifice far more than sharing a meal with hungry mothers ever could. The tension was unbearable. Whitmore's hand moved toward his sidearm, not to draw it but in a gesture of barely contained rage. You're finished, Harrison. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. I'll see to it personally. You've just thrown away your career for a moment of weakness. If showing compassion to starving children is weakness, sir, then I'll gladly be weak. If following my conscience is insubordination, then court-martial me. But I won't pretend that the uniform I wear makes me something other than human, or that the people suffering in front of me deserve that suffering because of where they were born. Among the Japanese mothers, something extraordinary was happening. Yuki had opened the tin Harrison gave her and was feeding small pieces of meat to her daughter. Aiko's eyes, dull with hunger moments, began to brighten. The child ate slowly, carefully, and for the first time in weeks, Yuki saw hope. But as she fed her daughter, she watched Harrison facing his colonel's wrath, watched him sacrifice his career for a stranger, for her child, for a principle. And something shifted in her understanding of the world. These weren't just occupiers. They weren't just the enemy. They were individuals, capable of tremendous sacrifice, capable of seeing beyond nationality to shared humanity. But then came the moment that would transform everything again, that would add layers of complexity no one anticipated. Another Japanese woman, older, perhaps 50, stepped forward from the crowd. Her name was Keiko Yamamoto, and unlike the other mothers, she spoke English, learned decades ago when she had worked for a British diplomatic family. Her voice, weak from malnutrition but clear in diction, cut through the confrontation. Please, please, stop. Every head turned toward her. She stood, straight despite her frailty, her traditional clothing immaculate despite its age, her bearing suggesting education and refinement. Colonel, she addressed Whitmore directly. You speak of Japanese atrocities. You're not wrong. We did terrible things. My own son, he died in Burma, fighting for beliefs I never shared, following orders he never questioned. When I learned what our soldiers did to prisoners, I couldn't sleep. The shame, it's crushing. But this, what your captain did, what your soldiers are doing now. This is the first time since the war ended that I've felt that maybe humanity survived. Maybe we're not all monsters. Whitmore's expression flickered, caught off guard. Madam, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us. Her voice rose, gaining strength. My grandson is 7 years old. He's starving. I found him yesterday eating dirt because he thought it might fill his stomach. Dirt. And I had nothing to give him. Nothing to tell him except that we lost the war, and now we pay the price. But when I saw this soldier, this captain of yours, give away food he clearly needs himself, I saw something I thought was dead. I saw that mercy isn't owned by one side, that compassion can cross enemy lines, that maybe, just maybe, humans can be better than their governments and their wars. Another voice joined hers, then another. Japanese women who had stood silent, afraid, now found words. Not all spoke English, but their tone carried meaning beyond language. They spoke of dead husbands and fathers, of children's cries in the night from hunger, of the impossible choice between blaming the men who occupied their city and thanking them for the smallest gesture of humanity. The crowd of civilians had grown, drawn by the commotion, and now Japanese men, elderly and young, added their voices. Not in anger, not in protest, but in something more complicated: recognition of shared suffering, acknowledgement of shared humanity, gratitude mixed with grief, hope mixed with shame. Lieutenant Barker, who had been so certain, so righteous in his anger, found himself facing Keiko Yamamoto, and something in her eyes, something in her dignified suffering and her honest accounting of her nation's sins while still asking for compassion, cracked his certainty. "I lost my brother in Burma," he said, his voice rough. "The Japanese tortured him before he died. They sent us pieces of his identification tags. How am I supposed to forget that? How am I supposed to see these people as anything other than responsible?" Keiko looked at him with infinite sadness. "You're not supposed to forget. Neither am I. Neither are any of us. We carry our dead with us forever. But Lieutenant, your brother didn't die so you could starve Japanese children. He died hoping the war would end, hoping peace would come, hoping that someday, somehow, the killing would stop. Honor him by being the peace he couldn't live to see." The words hit Barker like a physical blow. His face crumpled, years of carefully maintained hatred suddenly revealed as a shield against grief. He stood there, this young officer who had held his anger as armor, and it fell away, leaving him vulnerable and human and uncertain. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to stop hating." Harrison, who had been watching this exchange, stepped closer to his lieutenant. "You start by recognizing that hatred is exhausting, James. You start by acknowledging that revenge won't bring him back. You start with one small act of choosing compassion over anger. Just one. And then maybe another. And slowly the hate loosens its grip." Barker stood there for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Then, with trembling hands, he reached into his pack and pulled out his own rations, a tin of biscuits and a small amount of cheese. He walked to Keiko and placed them in her hands. "For your grandson," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Keiko took the food and then did something that nobody expected. She set it down carefully and opened her arms, embracing this young British soldier who moments before had represented everything she feared. Barker, shocked, stood rigid for a moment, then collapsed into the embrace, sobbing, releasing years of pain and hatred and guilt in that connection with a woman who should have been his enemy, but was, in that moment, simply another human being who understood loss. The scene broke something open in everyone present. British soldiers who had held back now came forward, not just sharing food but making contact, kneeling to speak with children, helping elderly civilians sit, offering water, offering presents. Japanese civilians who had viewed the occupiers with fear and resentment now saw individuals, saw humanity, saw the possibility of healing. The barriers between victor and vanquished, occupier and occupied, enemy and friend didn't disappear. They were too real, too recent, too painful, but they became permeable, crossable, less absolute than they had seemed moments before. Colonel Whitmore watched all of this with an expression that gradually transformed from rage to confusion to something that might have been recognition. He was a career military man, trained in hierarchy and order, but he wasn't entirely without conscience. He saw his men, saw the civilians, saw the transformation happening in front of him, and somewhere in his rigid military mind, a question formed. Was order and protocol really worth more than this? Was enforcing the barriers between humans really the purpose of his authority? But then came the final revelation, the element that would cement this story in the minds of everyone present. Harrison, exhausted from the confrontation, from the giving away of his own food, from the emotional weight of the moment, swayed slightly. A Japanese man, middle-aged, perhaps a doctor or professional by his bearing despite his shabby clothes, stepped forward and caught him. "You need to sit," he said in accented English. Harrison, too tired to protest, allowed himself to be guided to a piece of rubble that served as a seat. The man examined Harrison with a practiced eye, then spoke quietly but firmly. "When did you last eat a full meal?" Harrison laughed weakly. "Define full meal. You're suffering from malnutrition. Second stage. Your body is consuming itself. This is dangerous." The man who introduced himself as Dr. Takeshi Sato looked at Harrison with concern that transcended nationality. "You gave away food you desperately needed. So did you, probably, if you're still here helping people instead of fleeing the city for food," Harrison replied. Sato smiled sadly. "We're both fools then. Noble fools, but fools nonetheless. He turned to address Whitmore, who had approached. "Colonel, your captain is in medical danger. He needs rest and proper nutrition immediately." Whitmore looked at Harrison. Really? Looked at him. Perhaps for the first time seeing not just an insubordinate officer, but a man pushed to the edge of his physical limits and still choosing sacrifice. The colonel's face showed an internal war. Decades of military training versus something more fundamental, more human. Finally he spoke, his voice different, quieter, less certain. "Captain Harrison, you're relieved of duty for medical reasons. Report to medical services immediately." Harrison started to protest, but Whitmore held up a hand. "That's an order, Captain. But it's not a reprimand. It's—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "It's concern. For one of my men, who apparently has been running himself into the ground trying to save the world." The transformation in Whitmore wasn't complete, wasn't sudden, but it was real. He turned to address his soldiers and the gathered civilians. "There will be—" He cleared his throat. "There will be an official investigation into today's events, but pending that investigation, any soldier who wishes to share personal rations with civilians has temporary permission, provided it doesn't compromise our operational readiness." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "Captain Harrison's actions, while technically in violation of protocol, were— He struggled, then finished simply, "They were human. That will be noted in my report. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't redemption, wasn't transformation, but it was a crack in the armor, a first step, an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there were values more important than regulations, that humanity could survive even military hierarchy, that compassion wasn't necessarily weakness." The immediate aftermath was practical and profound. Dr. Sato organized the Japanese civilians to share what they had received, ensuring the most vulnerable children and elderly received portions first. British soldiers who had watched the exchange but not participated now quietly added what they could. Someone produced a small camping stove, and tea was made. British tea shared among British soldiers and Japanese civilians. A beverage that became communion, connection, the dissolution of boundaries one cup at a time. Yuki sat with her daughter, feeding her slowly, carefully, making the food last. Harrison, despite his exhaustion, sat nearby, and in broken Japanese and English, they talked. She told him about her husband, a fisherman who had been conscripted and never returned. Harrison told her about the students he had taught, children not much older than Aiko, and how he had promised himself that if he survived the war, he would try to build a world where no child would have to go hungry, because adults couldn't stop fighting. They didn't solve anything with their conversation. They didn't erase history or undo suffering. But they saw each other, really saw each other. And in that seeing, the category of enemy became insufficient, too small to contain the complexity of human connection. As the day wore on and the gathering slowly dispersed, something had fundamentally changed in that corner of Yokohama. Not for everyone, not permanently, not without complications and setbacks. The occupation would continue. The suffering would continue. The memories of war would haunt both sides for generations. But for those who had been present, for those who had witnessed and participated in this small revolution of compassion, the world would never again be quite as simple as us versus them. Victor versus vanquished. British versus Japanese. In the weeks that followed, word of the incident spread. Some British officers condemned Harrison. Some Japanese civilians remained suspicious of any occupier's motives, but others on both sides began to see possibility. Small exchanges became more common. A British medic treating Japanese children, a Japanese woman teaching English to curious soldiers, a shared reconstruction effort, cleaning debris, rebuilding, working side by side. None of it was official. None of it was policy. But it happened, these small acts of crossing the divide, and each one was a testament to the truth that a single moment of compassion, one choice to share rather than hoard, to connect rather than divide, to recognize shared humanity rather than emphasize difference, could ripple outward in ways that no military strategy or diplomatic agreement ever could. Harrison eventually recovered his health, though he remained thin for months. He never faced court-martial. Whitmore's report, while noting the protocol violations, emphasized the positive impact on civilian-military relations and the exceptional circumstances. But more importantly, Harrison never forgot Yuki's face when she realized he was hungry too. Never forgot the moment when enemy became human. Never forgot that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the small brave choices we make to see each other, really see each other despite every reason not to. Years later, when historians would study the occupation of Japan and the remarkable transformation from enemies to allies, from war to peace, they would point to major policy decisions, to the generosity of reconstruction aid, to strategic diplomatic moves. And those things mattered. But they would miss the foundation upon which that transformation was built. The countless small moments when individuals chose compassion, when soldiers shared rations with civilians, when mothers saw the humanity of their occupiers, when enemies discovered they were humans first and enemies second. The lesson of that day in Yokohama echoes across time, across conflicts, across every divide we construct between ourselves and others. It whispers the uncomfortable truth that our enemies are not monsters but humans, that their suffering is as real as ours, that hunger feels the same in every language, that compassion is not weakness but the highest form of courage,